And for those that don't know me, I'm Winnifred Lewis, and I am introducing our PEPSS seminar on behavior change and system change, friend, foe, or folly, possibly our favorite title, right, of the series so far. I want to pause and acknowledge that here in Brisbane, we're on the contested lands of custodians that have been with country and generating knowledge and exchanging knowledge for tens of thousands of years. We pay our respects to their ancestors, past and present, and acknowledge their continuing cultural and spiritual connections to country. We recognize their contributions to Australian and global society. Chris, if you can just mute people that might pop in and not quite have that sort of. And so in the chat, we've got Chris Clable, who'll be monitoring and maybe muting people that have forgotten to mute on entry. And online, we have both of our speakers who are based in Victoria. For those that haven't been to PEPSS before, our format is that each speaker will talk for approximately 20 to 25 minutes. And then we will have a reflection by each speaker on the other speaker's talk. And then we'll have an open conversation for however much time is left. We may need to exit the room quite punctually at sort of 5 to 12, as we're in a teaching space during the teaching semester. So sometimes the conversation continues as we walk out the door. But since both of our speakers are online, we do need to make sure that we manage the time in a punctual way. I also want to acknowledge, though, that the presentation is being recorded. I'll just change this, sorry, for a second. And that if you don't want to be recorded, you may want to leave your video off and post your comments in the chat. The edited recording of the seminar will be available at our website. The website for the PEPSS page is just socialchangelab.net/PEPSS. And if you are not already on the email list, you're welcome to add yourself to that list by contacting us through the SIGN email. This series is co-sponsored by SIGN, as well as the Social Change Lab and CRISP. These are all social psychological groups here at UQ, and the Network of Environmental Social Scientists run by Kelly Fielding. So I think that's all I had to say, and I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to say over to you, Liam, if you want to share your slides while I just read out a biography. Many of us in the room will already know Liam, our first speaker. He's a professor and director of Behaviour Works Australia, and he was originally trained in environmental science and transitioned to a behavioral science focus through 3 higher degrees focused on human-animal interaction. In 2010, he established Behaviour Works Australia, and the research team now has over 30 staff. Liam's overseen hundreds of behaviour change projects in collaboration with government and industry partners. Liam, I'll just comment that we're looking at your presenter view, so you may want to swap the displays so that we can see your slides. He has published over 100 research papers, over 200 reports, and he's the lead editor on the book Inspiring Change. He's also currently sitting on the board of Inclusive Australia, and he's a councillor for the Biodiversity Council. Liam's held previous positions with Zoos Victoria's Scientific Advisory Committee, the Lancet Global Task Force on Non-Pharmaceutical Interventions for COVID-19, and Vic Health's Leading Thinkers Task Force. Liam, over to you.
Thanks, Winnifred. You can see me, you can hear me, and my vision is correct. Is that all good? Excellent. Well, yes, thanks, Winnifred. Thanks for asking me to be part of this presentation. It's a real privilege to be asked. I often look at UQ and there are and with eyes of jealousy. There's such great people up there, including you, Winnifred, Kelly. I can't see if you're in the audience. Angela Dean, people we've worked with for a long time and are really close friends and colleagues. And so it's a real privilege to be able to present to you. I'd also like to start by acknowledging that I'm on the lands of the unceded lands of the people of the Kulin Nation, for me, the East Kulin Nation in particular. The area where I live was a space where European settlers were given land, and only if they cleared it. So you can imagine that was really a double whammy for Indigenous folk, not only losing their land, but also losing their natural and cultural heritage that went with clearing land. So I'd really like to pay respects to elders past, present, emerging, and acknowledge that we haven't always done right. but hopefully that's changing. Our topic today, and I'm presenting, I think I'm going first and then Mitzi second, and just a note of warning, we haven't colluded at all in this. In fact, I have no idea what Mitzi's going to say. So our responses will be very genuine reactions to each other's presentations. So I'm going to give some, I think, a bit of a summary about these, I guess, different relationships and thinking between systems and behaviour change. It's been a topic that we've been thinking about a lot recently, and partly because of the second word in those three, which is foe. And I just want to start with a couple of examples that sort of showcase, I guess, why behavioural science, particularly when considered by sociologists or people that think in a much bigger realm than necessarily psychologists do, are sometimes quite disparaging. This is an aerial photo from Google Earth, and I did check I'm allowed to use this for research purposes and teaching purposes. I know that there's a crackdown on making sure that all the images are not being plagiarized. And so this is an image from Google Earth, which is of Townsville, and it's an aerial view of houses in Townsville. And when you look down on it, you can see that there on the left-hand side is a new estate, and all the roofs on that house, those houses are white. And the ones on the right-hand side are not all white, but a lot of pale colours. There are certainly no dark colours. And this is because probably one of, what I would consider, and many people would consider, a very successful behaviour change campaign, which was to try and encourage people in Townsville to paint their roofs or white, or to input white roofing on new builds. It was that behaviour was chosen as a whole selection process of, which behaviour should we focus on to try and get energy efficiency in the home, and then how might we use that prioritised behaviour of painting a roof white or installing white roof in new homes. Might we get people to do that, and a whole bunch of systems and things kicked into place to make that happen. And to all intents and purposes, a really great success. I'm going to point to another example of great success as well. And this isn't of the dam just north of Cape Town, because I wasn't allowed to use that image. But anyway, so this is one off Pixel. But many of you might be familiar with the Day Zero campaign in Cape Town, which was really a very considered to be a very successful marketing campaign, highlighting to the people of Cape Town that they were running out of water. And in fact, they were going to completely run out of water on this date at this time. And it was really designed to try and put people in the mindset of high levels of water conservation. They went down to 50 litres a day. I think they were about to, or even did in some places, go down to 20 litres per person per day. So incredibly low water use. And you might argue, on many fronts, equally successful behaviour change campaign. But I guess the reason I'm highlighting these two examples is because they're seen as successes, but actually, if you step back a bit, you can probably also say, well, climate change is still continuing, and actually it rained, and so they solved the problem. But really, the fix that Cape Town settled on for their water shortage supply was to build some desal plant to try and to compensate. And so behaviour was sort of a temporary stop. Maybe it worked a little bit, but actually, it really was a very small Band-Aid on a very, very big problems. And therefore, we might be using behaviour change as an excuse to try and say, hey, we're get some change, rather than concentrating on the more significant policy or other or systemic sort of changes we might need to do. So this has been the criticism of behavioural science for quite a long time. Probably some of you might know people like Elizabeth Shove, who and even Jeff Sachs, when he visits, they don't really think that behaviour change is the solution to significant systemic problems. They think it's much more financial structures and institutions and policy and regulation. Those are the sorts of tools that those people think about. So that's kind of what, to sort of encapsulate a few of the criticisms of behavioural science. I thought I'd present a couple of, I guess, outstanding examples, but then also reflect on whether, were they really truly outstanding examples? We really need decentralized water systems, we don't necessarily do desal. And behaviour change probably was seen as a sort of temporary fix while we did the big infrastructure fix. So folly. So I guess this is to think about the second word first, and I'll get to the friend bit at the last because that's the more positive outlook. So I guess as a folly, I think it's to think about. So I've got a couple of doctoral students who are really trying to ask this question about why do people really behave the way they do, and there's one of my students who's doing her doctorate. She's just published a paper. I can certainly share this link. It's in Resources Conservation Recycling Advances. That's looking at reviewed all the literature from not just psychology, but a whole bunch of disciplines to try and understand why people are recycling or not recycling in their homes. And she's been really broad in ensuring she searches different databases, and her search terms have been really wide in order to capture as much as she can. I think it was around 100 studies she was able to draw down and to include in her paper. And what she found was there are lots of things that drive behaviour. These are the socio-demographic and individual. This sits in the individual. These are some socio-and demographic things. These are some other things. These are some middle-level things. These are some macro-level things. And they all came up as drivers of behaviour in different literatures and in different bodies, 131 of them. And so when we look at the literature to say, why do people do the things they do, there are lots and lots and lots of reasons that all come together. Some we're very conscious of, some that we're less conscious of. But the literature as a collective has really been done pretty well at identifying. Well, actually, we would correct that. We actually a little bit critical of it, but anyway, you can read the paper and learn more. So it's complicated. Another doctoral student of mine is looking at why people bystand or don't bystand inside organisations. So, stand up for someone that's being bullied or similar. And that doesn't have to be immediate confronting. It can be later on. It can be consoling the person and whatever. So she's done a similar exercise, but she sort of synthesised it into some social ecological model type framework. And these are some of the findings of her paper, which is currently under review. And then, if you do a system map, which we've done in some of our work, and this is a system map that was drawn in a workshop around problem gambling to try and understand why people gamble. It's messy. There's lots of links. There's lots of power dynamics. There's lots of infrastructure. There's institutions. There's laws and regulations. There's relationships. There's power that flow throughout this whole system that really tries to influence, that leads to, I guess, to why people become gamblers. And I don't think this is particularly unique. In fact, you can see equivalent horrendograms for all sorts of other things. And you've probably seen these in some of your work. And so the question really is, if you think about these couple of points I made in this folly category, wow, behaviour is super complicated. It's influenced by so many different things, and it's super complicated and it's super complex. Are we just tinkering around the edges and so is it folly, I guess, to go ahead and try and get change into systems?
Some of these coals burn at over 1,000 degrees.
Sorry, I think I've got someone who needs to be muted. Thank you. So that's kind of all the downside, I guess, and that's to sort of level a whole bunch of criticisms and sort of paint a bit of a picture of why it's really hard and why systems and behaviour are often seen as strange or uncomfortable bedfellows. But I think there are a few ways that we can do behavioural science a little bit better that might help us. And so I've just jotted down a few ideas here. This is a subset, I guess, of a few others that we've considered around how we might use behavioural science to think differently and ideally to try and influence systems. So here's the first question, and which is start thinking differently, which is why don't people behave the way they do? And so in behavioural science, often we see presentations with bar graphs that say we tried this, 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 and this, and we got this amount of change in this or in, with this intervention or this intervention, this intervention. And if it's a one-off behavior, you might get a 20 or 30, even 40 or 50% change if you're really lucky. If it's habitual, you might get 2 or 3% change, but very small, right? But the point is that's often seen as successful. We say, oh man, we got 50% extra people to do X or Y. We've got 20% of people to do, whatever. And that's seen as successful, but let's take the 20% example. Well, 80% didn't change. And isn't it worth understanding why or why not? Why didn't they change? And so to try and, investigate it. Another student of mine, and it's wonderful that you can draw on all these students' work to present to do presentations. Another student of mine is looking at getting repair as a behaviour of interest and trying to get things like small appliances like kettles and toasters and the like, and microwaves repaired. And what she's doing in her work is finding a group of really willing people. So people that would love, they've got a lovely kettle like this one here. It's been serviced them well for a long time, and they don't want to get rid of it. They think it's still got value and they want to get it repaired. And then these people are going to go and try and do that and then document, I guess, the reasons why they weren't able to and the things that stopped them doing something that they would really want to do. And this has been something that's been done in the low waste living CRC. Mitzi, I don't actually know if you've been involved with this. Maybe it's no. Okay, that's a no. But the low waste CRC has actually done a similar thing. They've found a group of really motivated people. Yes, I stick my hand up. I really want to. I want to live a low waste life. They gave them a whole bunch of options for things they could do to be to generate less waste, such as the picture here would be one example. And then they got them to diarise the reasons, how they went with it, I guess. And funnily enough, and surprise, surprise, a lot of people struggled. They really couldn't do behaviours they really wanted to do. And there were lots of reasons for it, which they documented. And they also thought about how they might overcome those things and et cetera, et cetera. But at the end of that project, which was led by my colleague, Rob Raven, they came up with a whole bunch of policy options of things that ought to change if they were able to live out their desire or fulfill their motivation to live in low carbon or low waste, living better. So that's I guess one category. We can use behavioural science as a system diagnostic. So we should always, sure, let's celebrate when we get the change, but let's also think about those that don't change and why. And I think that could be a really useful framing for using to understand where systems pushes back, particularly for those that are motivated to behave how you want them to. The second kind of idea that I think is worth mentioning is there are some particular behaviours, there are some particular audiences that ought to be the target of our work, because we know when we see graphs like that one around problem gambling, we know they are really pivotal pivots in or influences in that system. And to give you, a couple of examples, obviously key policymakers and decision makers, political leaders. So we ought to do more to try and understand political decision-making and how that can be influenced. A student of mine looked at political decision-making in a mock forum of a whole bunch of former political and decision makers, so former politicians as well as chief of staff, as well as secretaries of departments. We got them together and we discussed an issue and how you get it up and how you get it down and the inner workings of what policy that a cabinet would have looked like. And we're able to sort of understand the heuristics and biases and decision making that was there. And we need to, and I know that there's some of you at UQ have also done that work, and I think we need to do more of that as well. There are also key audiences like that have carriage of really important things like riparian zones. And those audiences we should go for directly. So if a farmer has a riparian zone and we know that getting a change in that audience or along a river or something like that, we'll get a good outcome, we should go for those audiences. They feel like these feel like sort of special audiences that we ought to target. The other thing that I've learned a lot, because I mentioned Rob Raven before, he's a researcher in transitions, and we've been collaborating on a few things recently. is he says it's never that hard to think about the future system. You know, we can always ideate and it's great and wonderful to think about a beautiful future. But the hard part, and it's not even hard to start new initiatives or new institutes or new whatevers, but the hard part is stopping what we're currently doing. That's the hard part. And so when we think about from a behavioural science perspective, what can we do sort of to help that? So, and I think about, say, something like, you know, in Victoria, we've just declared a native forest logging ban, which has just or is about to come into effect. So no native forest logging, but there's a whole bunch of people that work in the forestry industry. So what behaviour change work can we do with them to think about what else they could do instead of being you know, foresters or loggers? Maybe they could be tour guides, maybe they could be recruited for research. You know, there are a bunch of other things, but behavioural science should play in that space, right? Because the decommissioning stuff is the hard stuff in system change. There are people that are cogs in wheels. So, you know, I mentioned before, key policymakers, key decision makers. We talked about politicians, but there are others in particularly the machinery of government, but also in businesses where we can find, you know, at that kind of deputy secretary or executive director level that can be actually really important people to target as well. So people that are cogs in wheels or the enablers, their behaviour, and in fact, the behaviour of interest should be the enabling, not necessarily a behaviour of an end user, but the enabling of something to happen that then may lead to and ultimately lead to a behaviour down the track of a target audience. So they're sort of audiences, some particular types of behaviours that I think are kind of important around driving system change. So one is political advocacy, lobbying, that category. We don't go there often enough. We ought to. Some of the work that I've seen that has done this really well includes this Don't Palm Us Off campaign. Some of you might be familiar with it at Zoos Victoria, where people would visit the zoo and visit an orangutan exhibit. And then afterwards, they could go to a supermarket and look at a whole bunch of different products and then and scan them and see if they contained palm oil or unsustainable or not CSPO, just what was likely to be palm oil that comes from a plantation that's resulted of chopping down a native forest or a habitat of an orangutan. And so, and then said, asked visitors directly on the spot to write an email to CEOs of the 5 major importers of palm oil, asking them to stop doing so and to only use certified sustainable palm oil. This campaign ran for a few months, and within that time, all five of those companies had committed to only importing sustainable palm oil. They had different timelines. I actually haven't followed up recently to see where at. Some had actually swapped. I don't think they all had when I last heard, but Zoos Victoria, I think, are talking about running this campaign again, perhaps to sort of remind these businesses that they need to, that there's pressure to move. So this kind of thing can drive more systemic change and certainly can drive, and we know in other work that we're doing that, you know, we can use this type of lobbying and to try and persuade decision makers. Another category of behaviour I think is important, particularly to drive business behaviour, is around consumption. One of the great projects that we're involved in that was with trying to encourage people, again at a zoo at Taronga Zoo, who visited the seal show, to buy MSC products, so Marine Stewardship Council products. Those products at the time weren't available at the 2 major supermarkets, Coles and Woolworths, and they got wind of the fact that Taronga Zoo was going to launch this campaign and encourage, and that only Aldi stocked this product. So within not very long time, both of those supermarkets had this MSC products on their shelves, and indeed Woolworths had supported Taronga Zoo to do some work in advocacy to try and encourage more people to buy it. And so we were able to use sort of, the funny thing was that never really resulted in behaviour change. It was just the threat of it, really, that resulted in some pretty significant changes in business operations. So that's kind of a second idea. The third and I guess last idea that I just want to raise, and I'm just checking time, I think I still have a few minutes left, is around spillover. So spillover is this idea that by doing one behavior, it predisposes you or increases the likelihood you might do another behavior that is similar. There are some theories of behaviour of spillover. This is one that comes from John Thurgerson, who was probably one of the lead protagonists around behaviour. We commissioned him probably 12 or 13 years ago to write a paper for us, sort of outlining the different theories. This is what he came up with. And we can see there's lots of moderators and mediators, well, mostly mediators of what one behaviour going to another. And indeed, some students, including some that Kelly and I have supervised and Winnifred and I have supervised, have sort of explored some of these factors that help you shift from one behaviour to another. But here's a question: what second behaviours should we encourage? Some work Sarah Kneebone did, looked at, so she mapped this is around water saving. She mapped them on what we call an impact likelihood matrix, how much water you save on the vertical axis, and then how likely people were going to do it on the x-axis, and really to try and understand, how we might prioritise some of these behaviours. She classified them as what we call efficiency behaviours. So these are things that are sort of more one-off behaviours, maintenance, so sometimes behaviours, and then curtailment, which are sort of, efficiency are one-offs, maintenance are sometimes, and curtailments are things you do pretty regularly. And then she also looked at how people perceive them to be similar. And so she found all these groups where they seem to align. And if we think about that question of what second behaviour, so if people do one thing, what might they do next? Well, we probably want to think about getting them to doing anything in the first place, which might be down in the bottom right-hand corner. So likely to do, but maybe not make a big difference. And then try and leverage to similar behaviours that are in some of the two top quadrants. So we might want to think about what that second behaviour is being more impactful. But that's actually one way of thinking about spillover and how it might be helpful. But the other thing I'm really keen on thinking about, and perhaps, oh, look at that, that's not supposed to be there, is how we might get people to shift not only from behaviour, but to policy support. And some work done by John Thurgerson and a student of his at the time, Carolyn Noblet, did some work that looked at, does doing a pro-environment behaviour also increase the likelihood, or seem to be associated with increased support for wind farms? Now, you would argue that's pretty logical, that would be true. So more people doing pro-environmental stuff would be more supportive of wind farms, but they also controlled for attitude. So essentially, two people care the same, but those that are also doing behaviours as well as caring, seem to be more supportive of wind farms than those that weren't. So there's something in there here that suggests that just getting people to do, but also having a policy target, may be something there that we can help try and leverage off action to get policy support that ultimately might lead to some of the things that we saw, for example, the people suggested in low waste living as policies that might want to be targeted. I'm conscious that's probably my time slot allowance. I'm not sure, I can't remember the format where there's questions now, or if it's Mitzi, then back to questions later on, but I'm happy to take them. Thanks, Winnifred.
We do ask people to hold their questions. Please feel free to pop them in the chat so that Liam can be thinking, during Mitzi's presentation. Although, Mitzi, if you wanted to share your slides now, I'm just going to go ahead and read out a bio for you. And what we'll do is we'll have our second speaker and then the reflections of the speakers before we go to audience questions. But as I say, please feel free to put them in the chat for our Zoomers. And it's nice to see such a big number of them. So Mitzi Bolton is a research fellow at the Monash Sustainable Development Institute, coming from 12 years in the Victorian and Australian public sector. She held an array of leadership and policy roles across both technical and administrative functions. And Mitzi is particularly interested in how system leverage points can connect science and policy to assist the transition to more sustainable futures. Mitzi's research is currently exploring the questions of how AI might be applied in the transition, and she stands in an advisory role to a variety of very long acronyms. Maybe I need to put my glasses back on, but I'll just say to a variety of industry and government working groups. Mitzi, I did see your slides pop up, but they've disappeared now. Did you want to reshare?
I think I disappeared as well. Apologies for that. I'll try again.
Okay.
Is that better? Jump ahead.
It's still loading. Yep, but it's come up now, and I'll just pin you for a moment onto the video. There we go. Oh, sorry. Try that again. Okay, please go ahead.
Great. Sorry for popping out there, and thanks very much for having me. I think I actually on the title of friend, foe, or folly, I think it may have been folly on my part to agree to follow an exec director from my institute on a topic that is basically he's one of the world experts on. But anyway, here I am. So I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land I'm joining you from today, who are the Bunurong people. That's their sea, sky, trees you can see in the M. And I'd like to pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging, and also to acknowledge that their land was never ceded. So we know a bit about Liam. Who am I? I am an early career researcher at MSDI, as was just mentioned. I was an environmental scientist working in private consultancy. I moved into the public sector, worked at EPA Victoria for almost a decade as a scientist, policymaker, regulatory intervener, I guess. Also at Premier and Cabinet in Victoria on public sector reform and the Productivity Commission. And while I was doing all of those things, I was also often the government representative to a few industry peak bodies. So I've got their insights as well. And all of that led me to get really frustrated with the way that we make public decisions. And so I embarked on a PhD, and that led me to MSDI, where I'm a sustainability governance researcher, which basically means I'm trying to find ways to improve how we do public decision making. I don't really care what tools we use, so long as they work. And that there's proof that they work, and they're things that decision makers can take up easily. And the sole goal for me is to enable sustainable development. And I don't think about sustainable development as a sort of environmental thing solely. I think about it in the kind of world mission, our common future approach, which is basically it's integrated decision making. How do we make choices now that enable us to live healthy and prosperous lives, but also don't limit the choices for future generations? So I will make very clear, I'm not a behavioural scientist. I also want to echo Liam's point that we have not colluded at all because there's some overlap in our presentations. But yes, here we are. I think I'm still a public servant at heart. Definitely that's where a lot of my thinking comes from. I wouldn't normally mention this, but I mentioned that I'm a newish mum. My son's 15 months old. And I mention that because in the last 15 months, whatever kind of fervor I had before with the frustration at the pace of change, it's like redoubled. Whatever impatience I had, I'm just so impatient now. And so the point I'm making is that we don't have time for follies. So with that said, let's move on. What actually is a folly? Liam touched on it. You've got the Macquarie dictionary definition there. I really like the third point, a useless but costly structure. And on the right, you've got this tower from the House of the Bins. What a name for an estate, hey? If your house is called the House of the Bins. And you can see this tower from the train line between Glasgow and Edinburgh in Scotland. My husband's Scottish, so I've seen it a bit. And I said to him numerous times when we first arrived, like, what is that thing? He's like, oh, it's just like a tower. And I was like, yeah, but what's it for? And he's like, no, it's just a tower. And one day we went to this house, and sure enough, it's just a tower. And the reason they built it was because some wealthy men had a wager one night, presumably over beer or wine or whiskey. And I'm like, oh, what's the most ridiculous thing we could do with our money? And the thing that they came up with was to build this tower. And it looks good. And it used to have a staircase. It doesn't have a staircase anymore, so you can't even get to the top. The windows are not functional. You can't see any better across the landscape than what you can standing at the bottom. It doesn't really protect you from wind or rain unless it's coming from a particular direction. So it's quite eye-catching, but it's really just a pile of bricks. And so I think that's kind of important to keep in mind when we're thinking about folly, and not to be too provocative, but to also kind of keep that in mind when we're thinking about behaviour change. So getting on to behaviour change, when I think about it, I'm talking about it at the individual level. I think Liam was too, and that seems to be where a lot of the kind of popularised literature focuses. Even with sort of more society-wide or community-wide interventions, You're often still, even like the rooftop thing that Liam mentioned, you're still relying on individuals to respond as you want them to. So I'm not really going to cover the literature on what's wrong with it. There's a lot, as Liam mentioned, out there already. There's people at UQ who have touched on behaviour change, things like behavioural insights. You could look up Sarah Ball. I think she did her PhD at UQ on that, so there's plenty there. I'm going to think about it more from my perspective and my research. So if we just took it on face value, behaviour change is a friend. I mean, everything that we do is inherently behavioural, right? So it makes sense to kind of focus on that. And if, as the literature shows, as Lima shows, we can motivate people at both the sort of intrinsic system 1 and system 2 levels, surely that's going to help us improve outcomes. Surely gently encouraging people to take actions that will improve their lives and society's life at heart, surely that's a good thing. Like, why would anybody argue with that? I'm going to argue with that because, as Liam sort of touched on, I'm worried for some of the reasons that he touched on. I'm worried that people get excited about it, and you definitely see that in the public sector. Like, there's a whole behavioural insights team within central agencies. They're excited about it. It's something simple. We can put it on nice placemats, they call it, the A3 kind of flow chart of what we're doing to drive a change in an area. And I think it provides a bit of a psychological boost from doing something proactive to drive change. But I kind of worry that behavioural science is a little bit of like wish cycling for people. Hopefully most people in the room are familiar with that idea of wish cycling. It's kind of like, oh, I've got this stuff, can it go in the recycling bin? Oh, they'll work it out there. I'll just pop it in. And I think that's kind of people go, oh, behaviour change, does it really work? Well, there's no harm in trying, is there? I'm worried that there is a little bit of harm in trying, and it's sort of this folly, it looks pretty, and it distracts us from the more systemic actions that we need to take while the world's burning. So in that regard, perhaps because it's a folly, it's really a foe. It's a bit of a distraction from where we really need to be focusing our efforts, sort of wasted utility. And it's a shiny buzzword, and we're sort of training people, we're pushing people into training programs, sorry, Liam, on this one approach when perhaps others or a mixture of others would be more effective. And then the cost of that is not just the cost of the program and the time to do the program, it's also the lack of attention towards other things that could be more impactful. If you're really nefarious, and I'm definitely not suggesting that Liam or my colleagues are nefarious, you could suggest that behaviour change is a bit of a ploy to make individuals think that they can solve our crises when we're really ignoring the larger paradigms at play that are running the show. And I think that's maybe what Liam was talking to about, say, Jeff Sachs saying we need to focus on finances and institutions and policy. I would also question whether or not behaviour change might be breeding a little bit of apathy from some people when things they invest time in subsequently fall over. So when you discovered that the soft plastics you'd been dutifully collecting, maybe it was a bit of a nuisance in the kitchen in the corner, but you felt like you were doing something good collecting it, taking it to the supermarket. When you discovered that that was just being kept in large stockpiles, presenting a huge fire risk to the community, did that kind of galvanise your recycling efforts? Did you go, right, well, I'm going to find a better way to do things? Or did you go, hell? And like when the next behaviour change thing came along, maybe your council sent you a FOGO bin, or maybe you were offered a low flow shower head. Did you take it up and go, okay, cool, well, the plastic stuff didn't work, but maybe this will? Or did you kind of question and go, you know what, is it really that added effort of separating things? Is it really worth it? I kind of like my rainwater shower head. How did that impact of the thing that you'd invested your previous behaviour change in? How did that impact your future choices? So I think there's a real risk there with behaviour change if it's not part of a bigger systems view. And so, yeah, I don't think it's the intent, but a lot of people have come to see behaviour change as a bit of a panacea, and I don't think it is. I think it's part of the solution, but it's definitely not the whole solution. And I think it's disingenuous to suggest that change on the scale needed for the transformations that humankind needs can be achieved through things like nudges. So, yeah, that's my kind of concern. So, to that point around whether or not it's disingenuous, I think we need to embrace this question by Anthony Giddens around whether or not it's the structures within our society and our institutions that we should be focusing our efforts on, or whether it's people's agency which matters most when we're seeking to drive transformations. And as most of my work focuses on the public sector, that's where I'm coming from. So I've interviewed a lot of people, surveyed a lot of people, and I've asked them all this question. Do you think that public decisions are more influenced by frameworks or by people? Because as academics, we love frameworks, right? Like if we come up with the Bolton framework, I'm golden. But most of them, the majority of them, it seems to be consistently about 78% of people think actually public decisions are influenced by people. And you get quotes from people like Terry, who worked in Victoria and then Ireland and then Scotland, and I think he's back down in London now, who say, you know what, it doesn't matter what framework you come up with, it doesn't matter what kind of approach you try to take. Whatever I suggest, if Treasury don't like it, it's coming down. And I think a lot of people think like Terry. Most people, some people are really good at influencing outcomes, and they're the ones that are going to have the say. But complexity kind of still gets in the way of those people. Even if you're like a really astute, kind of well-connected person, stuff still gets in the way. So then you get the views of people like this person who didn't want to be identified, but basically an ED, an executive director within central government, who said, you know what, I play a role in setting up the direction. I contribute to the direction, but it's not really going to drive the final transformations that we need. So really, I hate to say this, but I think I agree with the second person, because what they're really saying is that it's the broader system that drives the outcomes. Individuals are important, and where they want to be frank and fearless and do put their careers on the line to try to forge a way forward, if the ducks are lined up, they may be lucky and get it over the line. And some people talk with enthusiasm about how they've done that, and it's really great because they show examples. But most of the time, that doesn't happen. Most of the time, people push and push and push, and they make a small little change, a bit like us with our PhDs, hey? Another point that I want to make here is that even the nicest amongst us, right, even Liam, we're all a little bit self-interested at times. We tend to do what we want and what we think is best. So we can receive a behaviour change model. I'm going to take that roof. I like that rooftop example. Say I'm told to make my roof white or light, and everybody else is going white. I might want to be a little bit different. Maybe I think that white is too reflective and it's going to blind aircraft, so I'm going to go cream. Right, we all like to just intervene a little bit, and that's where things start to come undone. And it sort of means that you can have all these frameworks, but they don't work in a concerted way because everyone changes them a little bit. So for me, coming back to that Gibbons question, it's really about the systems that we operate in and how we can change those. That's important. That's where the true change can come from. So my research, I'm not going to encourage you to look at all of these, but my research tried to identify what factors influence public decision making. I guess it's a little bit like one of Liam's students looking at the behaviours. I found 40 factors that influence public decision makers, and I found these by interviewing them about how they go around their decision making and then doing thematic analysis. So there's a lot of factors. You can see in the green, some came up more frequently. They keep banging on about their personal characteristics and how they can make change, which is great. And then other things I kind of just mentioned in passing, like central agencies. But there's a lot of factors. Thanks, Sebastian. Might just get you to mute, but nice to see you. There are a lot of factors to be considered. So trying to work out which ones to focus on or which ones might be connected is kind of tricky. Like, this just seems to make it more complicated. So we're going to try to make some sense of that. Drawing on Stephen Covey's management theory regarding control and concern, which uses two circles, a fixed outer sphere of concern, so everything we're interested in. So that outer sphere in this case contains all of the factors, and then an inner circle of control, which kind of expands and contracts. Covey argues that if you focus on the things right in the middle, that darker blue circle will slowly expand and expand and expand until you have more control over more of the things of interest to you. So you can plot the 40 factors based on the relative ease of influence, or relative ease of control that your reasonable person would have upon them. And you can do that by looking at the literature and seeing how they're described across the literature, which I've done for each of the factors, and how decision makers describe them. And there's quite a lot of commonality in how they describe them, which is reassuring. So I think this is one way of thinking about, well, which factors could an individual decision maker focus on to try to drive change? So to be clear, I am saying that what the individual does matters, but what I'm also saying is that it needs to be viewed within the context of the overall system that they're a part of. And so again, this representation shows that there are some factors that you could focus on. So if behavioural science is focused on the personal characteristics of public decision makers right in the centre there, you are going to influence how the individual sees themselves and their place in the world and the little actions that they take. But it also, this diagram also shows numerous factors present in the operating environment of decision makers that individuals have far less or no control over. And these kind of factors are kind of essentially like the foundations and the wall and the rooftop of our institutions. All of these things build our institutions. If we don't seek to address them, we're going to continue with the same status quo, the same lock-in of what we're doing. So that's a bit depressing. What can we do about it? Again, Liam and I did not collude. If we take a network analysis approach, it's kind of dry systems map of the 40 factors, you can see a lot of interaction. So, for example, you can see these thick lines. They show us where there's really strong one-to-one interactions, where decision makers, when they're talking about the personal characteristics of decision makers, they're also talking about leadership. It might be their own leadership. It might be the leadership of people within their organisations. What this means is that if we were to focus on the personal characteristics of decision makers, we're going to have some of that spillover to leadership, which is a bit more on the periphery. So we start to bring some of those things in to the centre, which is nice. But again, there's not a lot of those really thick lines. There's just a couple. The other way to look at how it's all connected is to think about, well, how often are these different factors mentioned together? Are they kind of like Kevin Bacon's in the network, where if you focus on one, kind of has this domino effect to lots of others? And that's what the coloured circles show, the kind of Kevin Bacon's. So something like risk is not really mentioned by many people at once. I think it's about an 8th or a 9th as many mentions as the personal characteristics, but it's linked to everything. So it's an underlying factor. So if we were to focus on risk, perhaps it would have that kind of domino spillover effect to everything else. So that's another way of thinking about it. And at this point, you might be thinking, great, Mitzi, well done. You've developed a map of the complexity of public decision-making that has largely served to make the problem more complex, where this is really helpful. What it actually does, and where it is helpful is it shows us that focusing on any one factor or even several factors is not going to radically change how the overall system works. It's so tightly interconnected. The complexity is so great that pulling on one strand is just going to pull like another strand here. You can't make sense of this. So we can seek to change behaviours in the centre there, but it's not going to change everything else. We really need to be, and it would be foolish or folly to try, so we really need to be thinking about things at a systems level. And that's where I think system leverage points comes in and might be a really compelling way forward. I don't know the audience too well, but just briefly, if you're not familiar with Donella Meadows, this is her idea. She was an internationally renowned systems thinker, part of the team that did the limits to growth stuff from the 70s. And she came up with this idea that there are 12 points present within any system that are capable of driving change in the system. And she argued that there's actually a hierarchy to these points, which is important for me. She argues that the closer you get to leverage point 1, the harder it is to employ that leverage point. But if you are successful in employing it, the more change you will have throughout the system. Whereas 12 is where we spend a lot of our time in our public discourse arguing about what we should do. And it's also the easiest place to drive change. But it kind of just, any change you do there doesn't really change the system. So we might argue about how much indexation we should apply to HEX, and that's going to affect individuals in terms of how much they pay back. But whether that indexation rate is 4% or 3% doesn't actually change the system. Whereas getting rid of indexation altogether or getting rid of HEX altogether would be a deeper leverage point and would have a more significant change on the system. So I think system leverage point is really important. Another way to illustrate it, and if you go to Davila, she's got a great nice graphic that has lots of different icebergs all together. Lots of people think about it in this kind of iceberg model, with the easier, shallower leverage points above the water and the harder ones below the water. And I kind of wondered whether or not there might be something in that for my factors, my 40 factors. So moving on, you don't need to read this other than to know that the factors are on the left and the leverage points are on the top. If you assess each of the factors for its ability to operate as a leverage point, you get those white squares, and you might notice that there's kind of commonality. So every factor has the potential to operate as a reinforcing feedback loop within the public decision-making system. So we get it, we get more of it. We get it, we get more of it. And almost every factor, except for paradigms, has the power to change the system structure. That's really important. Again, reflecting on Meadows, she said that if you go deeper, it has more transformative change. So my kind of hypothesis, and this is what I'm testing at the moment, is that if we are to shift our thinking just 1 point deeper in the system, then perhaps that's going to have a ripple effect all the way up the system. So I'm suggesting that the reinforcing feedback loops, they sit just kind of at the top of the iceberg, just below the water, and that each of the 40 factors have these reinforcing feedback loops, preventing us from achieving sustainability outcomes. So we're going to struggle to disrupt these loops individually for each of the 40 factors. If we apply behaviour change to each of the 40 factors, that's a lot of effort. Whereas if we were just to have a look at the structure of information flows across the whole decision-making system, that's going to ripple up across all of the factors. That might sort of sound a bit basic. It might not seem that radical, just adding a little bit of information to a process here. You know, perhaps it's a regulator letting a stakeholder know, hey, you know what, this is not how you're meant to do that. This is how you're meant to do that. Here is the additional information. It is on our website, but it's a bit unclear. Let me step you through that. That is an example of an improved information flow. That is an example of helping somebody to understand how the system operates, and then that has flow-on impacts. And again, it mightn't seem so radical, but as a decision maker, making any change to what's an established process can feel like an active revolution, like you're really stepping outside the box. And I think that focusing on that flow of information might lead to incremental improvements, and then that ripple up through the system. You could also focus, taking my point, you could also focus on leverage point 3, the goals of the system, to try to overcome the structure of the system. But I think that's probably a little bit too revolutionary for most public decision makers. That would be things like changing our economic models, which as a public servant is not that possible. Whereas maybe if you're the finance minister, perhaps that's more achievable. But even then, how long will it last? I might pause on that idea. So I've banged on about information flows a bit and shown you lots of confusing maps. What would that actually look like in practice? In practice, I think it would be a bit of an information toolkit that a decision maker could go to and say, I've got this policy problem. What kind of tools would help me? And some of those tools might be behaviour change tools. But the point is, we need to understand the system to work out which tools, and not all of the tools will be behaviour change tools. Some of them, and this is an area I'm really, I've been spending a lot of time on over the past 4 years, are going to be around AI or advanced data science. It might be, for example, we had a case in Victoria where the state government was trying to work out which of 40 interventions they should apply to reduce the amount of pollutants ending Port Phillip Bay. And what we discovered through an optimization tool using AI was that there were 2 that kind of really stood out. The one that stood out the most, that was going to have the best impact, was going to cost $40 billion. Not really something that the government can just do right away, especially when it's coming from the Environment Department. Like, they don't tend to get the icing, like the top, all of the funds. So the second intervention was around improving regulatory implementation. So it wasn't actually even changing the regulations. It was just changing how they're implementing them. So a bit like what I was saying before, with the officer going out to see the stakeholders and saying, hey, do you know how to do this? And that was going to have enough of a reduction to enable the state to then be able to build the business case for the $40 billion intervention that will ultimately be needed. So that meant there were 2 interventions to focus on rather than 40, and that was gratefully received by the department. We only got to that because we were able to use optimization tools from AI that kind of cut through everything else. I don't think, well, I know that behavioural science didn't get there because that was one of the other examples. So that's where we need to get to. I'm conscious of time as well, but before I finish up, as I come to the end of my slides, you might be thinking, if behaviour change is a folly or a foe, then why has this model of Liam and Liam's team been so successful? And again, Liam and I did not collude. I have not had any training on the Behaviour Works model, so he might come at me afterwards and go, oh, you totally misunderstood it, or I might be blacklisted. But anyway, carrying on. Looking at this model that Liam's team has researched and published on extensively, I think there's like hundreds of papers, there's numerous PhD students that have come out looking at this model, and it's been successfully implemented within government many times. So it's clearly a great success. My provocation is to ask, and maybe it doesn't seem that provocative now because Liam kind of gazumped me, but anyway, is to wonder, is that success because of behavioural science, or is that success actually because the method engages deeply We're seeking to understand the system in which the behaviour change is desired. So if you have a look at this method, this is Liam's behaviour change method, and you have a look, I've highlighted in yellow all the steps that I think are actually systems thinking disguised as behaviour change. So I actually think the Behaviour Works method, or the Behaviour Works model, I think it's so focused on understanding, altering and evaluating the system in which the behaviour is coming from that actually it's more of a localised systems change method. So yeah, it's all about the systems. It's not about the behaviours. Behaviour is just like one part that might help you get the systems change that you want. So to sum up, yes, we do need to shift behaviours, but given we need to shift behaviours on so many dimensions concurrently in an ever-shortening time frame because of planetary boundaries and tipping points and climate change, I would argue we have to go for systems change now. That's where we need to put all of our efforts, because while we have to be cautious with systems change because there can be perverse outcomes, which I haven't talked to today, at the appropriate level of intervention, that information stuff is really kind of innocuous, but it's got so much potential. You can have change across whole swathes of behaviour across society much sooner, and that's what we need right now to drive the transformations that we're looking for. So that's it. I'll end there, and thank you very much for listening.
Well, thank you so much, Mitzi. And Liam, I know you could probably talk for an hour, especially with the provocative ending point that your entire career should be relabeled as system change works. But please try and keep to that 5-minute range, and then I'll come back to you, Mitzi, to reflect on Liam's talk. And then we'll have some time for discussion if that's all right. And of course, if we just hear from our speakers for 15 minutes each, I know a lot of people in the room would actually value that too. So 5 minutes is our very soft boundary. Over to you, Liam.
Thanks, Winnifred. Look, I think that was a great presentation, Mitzi, and I don't think you're actually going to get too much objection from me in terms of your assessment of our model. You know, we do spend a lot of time thinking about particularly in that first little rainbow piece of the model about, you know, what is the system, who are the actors, who are the stakeholders, and then before we sort of focus on specific behaviours that we want to change. So yeah, I actually don't necessarily disagree. And then, you know, even the deep dive where we're trying to understand reasons why people do the things they do. And I noticed you didn't circle proposed theories. Absolutely, we're using systems level theory there as well to understand. We saw a couple of the models that I presented from Jenny and Laura, who were absolutely using system level models to understand why people were doing the things they were doing. And so, yeah, I don't think you'll get much disagreement from me. I guess my main kind of feeling through what you were talking was this is still all behavioural, right? So actually nothing changes unless someone does something differently. And that could be a political leader. I think you mentioned a finance minister at one point, but being somewhat, you know, being a key actor that can implement change, or you know, a change maker that's happy to take risk. And the problem I think with the public sector is often there aren't many of those. And you know, I'm good friends. I won't name her because it's a bit derogatory what she said, but she was a former director of public sector innovation who said there is real innovation and leadership and appetite for risk in the public sector. It's at the very top and the very bottom, and everything else is permafrost. It's frozen. And so I think there's a bit of a challenge there that in the public sector to encourage people to be more brave, to be bolder, to take risks and to do things differently that really can drive change. I guess I would agree with your point that I think that the premise that we both made, I think is one in common around behaviour change. I think a big problem with it, and indeed a lot of the work we've done, is it's seen as a fix for something that that excuses someone from doing something more significant. So someone who's not willing to spend the political or capital or the financial capital or whatever else it takes to do something significant. So I do think that's right. And so behaviour change is often the go-to, but at the same time, it also has this really poor outcome, which is it pushes responsibility for change onto individuals. And I think, so I absolutely agree with that, which is why sort of in my talk, I said, maybe there are some individuals, but they're people in power, or they're people that have a really direct impact on something that we know we can get good outcomes if we target them. So whether they're cogs in the wheel or the farmers that, oversee riparian zones or politicians, I think understanding their behaviour is important. The other thing that sort of, and I'm conscious that I don't have a lot of time for reflection, but I just kept thinking there's this one quote, and it's a separate talk, and I didn't use any of it today, but it's one thing I've been thinking a lot about, is this one quote, which many of you will be familiar with, from Margaret Mead, the anthropologist, who said, never believe, I'm not going to get this exactly right, so forgive me, but never believe that a small group of committed people can't change the world, full stop. Indeed, that's all that ever has. And so it's got a lot of power, right? And I see a lot of NGOs and the like saying, that's our mantra, let's go do it. But actually, most small groups of committed people make no difference at all. But some do. And I think really understanding how we can make that transition is super important. I like the Meadows work. I've certainly looked into that and seen where behaviour change fits. And it fits all across it. A lot of it involves different people, whether they be key actors or decision makers or setting in place processes or making arguments in government. It involves actors everywhere. But some of it's just hard because either there's the lack of innovation or there's the lack of willingness to spend political, financial, social capital in order to do it. It's why we see second, third term governments do a lot more. Because they've survived one cycle. First term, they're just like, oh crap, this is not stuff up. And then second and third term, they tend to get braver, and actually they've bought the political and social license to be able to do more. So maybe there's something in that in terms of particular target audiences around being people, finding those people who are the influencers of the system and trying to help them pull some of those Donna Meadows sort of leverage points. But yeah, just a few not really coherent, but fairly loose reactions to some of the things you presented. But to return where I started, I don't really disagree with what you said. I think we spend a lot of time thinking about systems, and indeed it's guiding us, our thinking, more and more.
Thanks, Liam. You really undersell how insightful that was, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion later. But I want to give time now for Mitzi, if you'd like to go ahead and speak in response to Liam's talk.
Sure. I think I was kind of doing that a little bit through my presentation as well. But I guess some of the points that I want to pick up on, you mentioned Rob Raven's point around the hard part is actually stopping what we're doing. And I think that's because, well, I know that that's because a system always wants to reach equilibrium. Like if you're a chemist amongst us, you want to play with it. Whatever you add to the system, it will always try to find its way back. So I think you can get those change makers that you just mentioned, Liam, and they will put something in place. But unless it's like ground into the legislation, in effect, particularly in the public sector, unless it's ground in something like the Human Rights Charter. If that's in Victoria, the Human Rights Charter, every brief that goes to minister has to address the Human Rights Charter. That systems change has come in, which encourages or forces public decision makers at all levels to think about human rights and whatever they're putting up the chain. That's an example of where a change maker has said, you know what, this is important and we're going to do it. And it sounds simple, like stick it in a brief, but actually you're making hundreds of thousands of people think about the Human Rights Charter every day. And I don't know when that was put in place, but it would be a couple of, at least 10 years, if not longer. It's still there as far as I know. The system hasn't kicked it out. That's now part of the new system. Whereas a lot of other kind of changes that change makers try to bring in. So for example, the person I mentioned, Terry Ahern, he brought in this system where people had to implement changes to their businesses. It was required of businesses with a particular amount of waste production and energy usage or water usage. They had to implement changes to their business that would reduce energy or waste usage. So this was a cost to business to do this. And Terry got that through. And it lasted for, I think, about 6 years, maybe a little less. And then a change of government came in and said, oh, we can get rid of that. So it was really effective while it was there. Coca-Cola are on board with it. Initially, they were like, oh, we don't want to do that. But then they saw it had this massive improvement to their bottom line. So they're like, this is great. But even though they were on board, another government came in, don't like it, out. So I think that's the issue with sort of behavioural changes or change makers that come in and they put something in, and unless it is ground in the legislation, that can be a little bit tricky to get across. And I thought about that with your roof example. It was great that they had that policy in place, but unless it was in the legislation or the local council bylaws that everybody has to have a white roof, it's not going to be long before someone comes along and says, oh, you know what, I really like that ColourBond monument colour, which is a really dark blue colour. I want that for my roof. It's not going to be long before people change their roofs. And so I go, is your house hotter? Oh, maybe, but maybe it's just climate change. It's not my roof. So I think unless we embed these things within the system will always push back. So it can be hard to achieve that. I think as well, I really liked your students' work where they're exploring all of the behaviours. And you mentioned there's 131 behaviours that she'd identified in the literature. That would suggest to me that we don't really understand people's behaviours enough. Like, that's a complex system to try to understand people's behaviour as well. And I don't know how well we can do that to really get at the heart of issues in order to be able to unpick them and then put in place the right diagnostic to know the right behaviour. Again, I guess that's the purpose of your model, but 131 different guiding things that are driving this behaviour seems scary. I think maybe the thing I'll finish up on before we go to everybody else in the room was your example around palm oil. And again, I think I'm just going to highlight, and this might be our push, our to and fro, is that behaviour change or is it systems change? Because what I heard you describe was people being given information that they didn't have before and then being empowered to do something with that information to push back. And that created a negative feedback loop for the businesses that were using palm oil to say, hey, we need to do something here. So I think really that palm oil example is an example of using the system leverage points of information flow and negative feedback loops in order to drive a change in the system. So maybe it's semantics, but I do think we've got to focus on the system at large to get the changes that we need in the time frame that we have available. I might stop there.
Great. Could everyone join me in a round of applause for our brilliant speakers? And we do have a tradition of letting a student ask the first question, and that can be a student in the room, but also a student who is online. So sometimes that requires a bit of people having courage, and other times someone will just put their hand up. So sometimes I just keep talking until we see a student. Very good. I see two students. I'm going to go with you, Michael, since you're here. Go ahead, and I'll just repeat for the speakers if they can't hear.
All right, wonderful. Thank you very much for those talks. They were really, really excellent. I guess I'm still thinking about the comment about permafrost in between the top and the bottom of these public sector organisations. And to me, that's, once again, that's not behavioural, that must be structural. So I guess I'd love to know what your opinion is of what the biggest lever we could grab. Is it information flow? What are the levers to address that kind of inability to move things forwards at the middle levels?
Yeah, could you guys hear that okay, or should I repeat? Okay, go ahead, Mitzi or Liam. I'll let you decide who speaks first.
Liam, do you want to go first?
Look, I'm happy to have a couple of comments. I mean, so the nature of that comment was really just, it was talking about, well, the reason why she described in that way is because it seemed to be, and this is, her word from experience, not necessarily how behavioural science would do it, scientists would do it, which would be to go and talk to the people and understand exactly why they were doing or not doing something that we would want them to do to try and understand those drivers. But her real assessment was that everyone was either stuck in a system, and so that everyone, we all conform to norms. They're very powerful. If you join an organisation, you'll often find yourself, doing what everyone else does in that organisation. And one of the things that a lot of them do is make sure they cover their backside, to be frank, and don't take risks. And so her assessment was there's a lot of people that are just not willing to take risks and not willing to drive change because yeah, because of norms and because of perceived risk. They would be the things that she said. In terms of how we change that, maybe that's more Mitzi's work than mine. But yeah, maybe I'll hand over to her.
Yeah, thanks, Liam. I think it's a really, I don't know who you were talking about, but I've heard that point said before. And the people that in the permafrost tend to be managers. So they've got people reporting to them that are trying to implement standardized processes just to keep government running, essentially. But then they've also got people above them that are reporting to ministers. So they're stuck in the middle. They're this sandwich. They're the meat in the middle of being pulled of, oh, let's do this exciting thing, and then, oh, but no, these are also the constraints of government we have to work within. And they're kind of the ones that are trying to keep the systems of government within their bounds and not overstepping the mark of government. So it's a difficult place to be in, because they want to be, everyone that joins the public sector more or less is there because they're passionate about social and environmental change. They're passionate about good outcomes. They're not trying to be difficult. But then, as Liam said, the systems kind of force them into this box where they can only do so much. I think there's also assumptions made about what knowledge we have, what we are allowed to do, assumptions about what the minister wants. You'll often hear that within government. Minister wants this. Do they? Like, who asked them? On what basis do we think, oh, well, that's in this press? Who wrote that press release? Probably another public servant within Premier and Cabinet wrote that press release. So does the minister really want that? There's a lot of assumptions about that. So that's why I think information flows are really important, because you want to cut through the assumptions about what's there to really understand, what do we want? Why do we want that? And what kind of outcome are we genuinely seeking for? I think information flows is a way to go, but it is also a little bit of gumption on the part of the public servants in the middle there. They tend to be a little afraid. I'd be a little afraid too. So we need to provide them with tools that are kind of somewhat innocuous yet still powerful, would be my answer.
It's probably worthwhile noting, I don't know if you were there when John Merritt was the head of EPA, Mitzi, but he was the sort of leader that was a little different, I think, in that he often, I mean, maybe that wasn't your experience, I don't know, I'd be interested to hear, but he was the CEO and he often talked about safe to fail. He often talked about, the willingness to experiment. We did a whole bunch of experiments with EPA during our partnership with them, that some of which didn't work, right? We did some illegal waste dumping trials that just failed. In fact, they probably, and we not conclusively, but probably led to increases in dumping how we intervened. But he was willing to, take that on and learn more and then try something else. So I think there are some leaders that enable that kind of fail early, fail fast, or whatever that saying is, and to learn. But I would say that's probably not true of a lot of places.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring up John, because so John was the CEO and Cheryl Battlego was the chair, and they were really a team. And both of them, I had this tagline that is emblazoned in my brain of, if in doubt, protect. So they came into an organisation, I think Cheryl said the day she landed at EPA, she got an ombudsman's report basically saying how EPA had failed in relation to a landfill. And that landfill was leaking gas into people's homes, methane gas that could explode at any time. So people were removed from their homes, didn't know when it was going to explode, if it was going to explode. It didn't explode, but it took several months to kind of put in place measures. So Cheryl came into that, and she and John, and the reason that had all come about over years and years was because of this permafrost of, oh, no, don't raise that issue. It'll be okay, until it wasn't okay. So Cheryl and John really built this culture around, if in doubt, protect. Your job as an environment protection officer is to protect. And that then led to people going, junior members of staff saying, oh, you know what, I don't think this is right. And it led to other significant issues stopping, even though there were power imbalances. So I think you're right, Liam, that it does come down to change makers and individuals and the culture within an organisation. But that's not something that someone on the ground, you're coming in at a graduate level, or even if you're a manager level, it's not necessarily something that you can do across the whole organisation. So you can focus on it within your team, and it's wise, I think, to try and focus on it within your team. But we really need those change makers at the top to facilitate the people at the bottom to have great impact as well. But yeah, John was quite transformation.
So fabulous. I'm sure there's many questions. I can see hands up in the room, but I'm going to take advantage of my position to ask a question. You guys have managed to not really mention groups or power or identity, and those are things that many of us are really interested in. I think that's part of the kind of latent epistemic gap, Mitzi, in the language of information flows, because of course, many people, including Liam, including yourself, know that information alone is not the issue. And you talked about that just now when you said a junior person can't change the whole organization. Can I ask you both to reflect on power and groups and where they fit into maybe the bridge between individual behavior change and system change? For me, the level where groups change, where norms change, is that bridge. But you may not agree. Liam, Mitzi, do you guys want to comment?
It's a big question. I'll go to power first. I think the structure of organisations is a little different to society, in that civil society, I guess, in that there are formalised power structures, and we see them operate in different ways to influence behaviour. We've actually looked at that. So I've had a student look at that in the context of an organisation that was really trying to change. In fact, it needed to change quickly, and it was struggling. And we saw how power was used and how it affected actors within that organisation in order to get the changes that were needed. I've got to say, it's uncomfortable. Like the change was really not well received by a lot of people. Some people were left, others were made redundant because they were passionate about the old ways and sticking to them. So, but spending that political or that social or power capital, if you like, as leaders, I don't think you should do lightly, right? So I think you can do it and you can get change, but you can't do it all the time. I mean, we get a lot of criticism here by our Premier around COVID because he seemed to use a lot of power a lot in order to get outcomes. And so, and perhaps too much and too often, that we can debate that for forever and a day. But power, I think, and of course, power flows through all systems. And when we saw that map of, why people become problem gamblers, really thick lines, where we see power dynamics of how the gambling industry pays taxes and lobbies government that provides them a policy-friendly environment, or at least a less restrictive one that enables, so power is at play there. How that plays out into a behavioural science lens is much trickier. So, how do we disrupt those power changes? I'm not really sure of the answer to that, but I do know that someone needs to do something differently somewhere to get that outcome. I can't answer the question of who that is. We can get change through political leaders who hang their hat on something and say, this is something I'm passionate about. We can get it through groups who, Margaret Mead's groups, if they're successful and they can reach power and decision-making, then they can get change that way. We can also have social movements. I'm a little skeptical about social movements because we see things like, the riots that happened after Rodney King was killed, or we see, the rallies that happened as a result of mass shootings in the US. And so we see these huge, but yet they still hit up against power. And maybe it's because those groups aren't as well structured as the status quo groups like the NRA and others who are really powerful and have the ear of policymakers and can push back. So, I mean, I'm talking in an area that's probably more Mitzi's than mine, but when I think about behaviour and how they influence, when people are in groups, they join those groups or they participate in those groups probably because they share values, they share interests, and they develop their own norms, and that then guide their behaviour. If those norms and they can use that leverage of that group to get the voice and the ear of key decision makers, then I think you can get change. As a bit like we saw. No, it wasn't really the case with the palm oil example, but if that was more coordinated, sure. But I don't know, Winnifred. I'd be interested in your thoughts. I'm not sure really that many NGOs are that effective. I think there are plenty of them, and they're always lobbying, but we don't see a lot of change, right?
Yeah, I would talk, but I don't want to use that time, Liam. We'll have to catch up later because I think we'll probably see the end of the session out. Mitzi, if you wanted to comment on that, and then maybe we might go to other questions. I am writing a book, Mitzi and Liam, called The Psychology of System Change. So soon you'll be able to see my thoughts in 300 pages with, 30,000 words of references. Mitzi, did you want to reflect on that, or
Sure.
feel free not to if you don't want to? Yeah.
No, I might touch on the identity aspect because I think that's really important when thinking about public organisations. In my experience, public servants see their roles quite differently. It's often one of two ways. Either it's my role is to implement the will of the government of the day. Whatever the government wants, that's what I do. This is my position description. I do this. They're not interested in changing the system because they don't believe it's their democratic right to change the system. That is not the role of a public servant in their view. Then there's the other people who say, well, actually, it's impossible for a minister to know everything. So it is the role of the public sector to say, Prime Minister, that idea of yours, it's great. We might just need to do, if we did this, it would be even better. Or we might not want to do that because it's illegal, e.g. robo-debt. So you get people, that's the other view that's taken within the public sector, is that we need to advise ministers of what we could do. And what that then leaves room for is advice to encourage behaviour or systems change. And I think that's where you start to see the change makers, is they're in that second group of people that see it as their role to advise minister on how we can make changes. The other thing about identity, and this goes back to the point I made about people joining the public sector because they're passionate about something, they want to drive change, is that sometimes you can alienate your workforce through behavioural or systems change because it challenges what they see as their role in an organisation or what they understood the organisation to do. So that system or behaviour change makes them feel like, oh, actually, I don't belong here anymore. So that's something else that we have to be a little bit careful of. And it maybe goes to the group point a bit, where you can get groups within organisations that go, oh, we're all about this. And if the organisation changes, you get this mass exodus, which can be deeply destabilising. So that's one point. On the group aspect, just picking up Liam's point about social movements, I would agree. The social movement that I have the biggest issue with are things like change.org petitions. So if we were the UK, where the Parliament has to debate any public petition that's got over, I think it's 100,000 signatures, if that were the case here, then I'd like petitions. But that's not the case, at least not in Victoria, or it's not across Australia. So people sign these petitions thinking that they're going to have change. And I'll give you an example, a friend in the Latrobe Valley, someone started a petition saying, hey, we don't want this lead battery plant built in the Latrobe Valley. And they got a lot of people very animated, created a lot of fear about this lead battery plant, and made people think that they could have some impact by signing this change.org petition. The problem is they didn't understand the processes of how that lead battery plant was approved. And all the approvals had already gone through. So all that petition did was get a whole lot of people very upset about something they didn't really understand and make them think that government didn't want to listen to them because they'd already missed I think there were like 10 opportunities in years previous for them to engage in the process, and they weren't aware of that. Now that's partly the fault of government for not reaching all of the potential stakeholders, but it's also an issue with social movements in that they often don't reflect how decisions are made and then create these false narratives around what can be done to change things or why government isn't listening to us. So I get bees in my bonnet about change.org petitions. So I think that's where you have to be careful with groups. If groups don't understand the system that they're trying to affect change in, then they're not going to be very effective, other than to perhaps stir division or fear, which isn't really constructive. That would be my response.
Can I just add a very quick point to that? I mean, the social psychologist Robert Cialdini says he doesn't sign petitions because he knows if he does, it makes him vulnerable to do something else that is in line with it. Even for causes he's passionate about, there's a paragraph where he says, I do not sign petitions. So the behaviourist would argue signing petitions is good, but only because it predisposes other action or maybe if the petition in, like you say, in the UK does make a difference, fine. But But it also creates a whole bunch of people that are potentially vulnerable to other interventions. They become more likely to do things that are in line with that signing of whatever that issue is because they have signed it.
So fascinating. I mean, I think I see that there's 5 minutes left, but I also see there's no one standing at the door. Many of us, though, I want to respect the time frame, have to go for 12, including some people that have a 12 o'clock commitment. So let me just comment. I think part of it is the social license to operate as well. So it's in the case of a brave policymaker, part of what makes them brave is the sense that there's a constituency that will enable or support that. And in the case of the middle permafrost, part of what makes them cowardly is the structural constraints of their managers and the expectation, as you say, the norms. So when people sign petitions, that can be a way of making visible their attitudes to themselves and others in a way that allows the norm to change. And Mitzi, when you spoke about a brave, young staffer, it's that staffer who speaks out, and then it's everyone else that says, I agree, that empowers the change. It's the moment of what Emma Thomas calls consensualization, when the position is brought up and then people realize that there's actually a social power, a social license. That is what allows that group to change their policies, or that leader to feel like they're going to be brave today when they were cowardly tomorrow or yesterday. But anyways, I don't know. I feel like we have
Can
4
I just
minutes.
respond to that very quickly though, Winnifred?
Yeah, go ahead, Mitzi.
The corollary of that for that young staffer is they stick their hand up and say, we should do this. And they do it in a team meeting or the unit meeting or whatever. And the manager says, no, we're not going to do that. It's above your station. Like, that's not your role. Shuts down that person, shuts down everybody else that heard that idea. And then the team is stagnant because nobody else is going to raise their head above the parapet while that person's in charge. And often, your manager doesn't just stay there. They're off to go up and up and up the structure. So now everybody knows that anytime they see Liam Smith and he said no to Mitzi, well, I'm not going to raise anything to Liam. I want my career to go up. I don't want to be stuck here in the basement forever. So there's a lot that goes into, we definitely, I don't think coward is not necessarily a fair term. I think it's like a calculated decision for people to go, is this the one thing I want to die in a ditch over that I'm going to stake my livelihood on? Because if it goes south, it can go south badly. And that's where you need the organisational culture that people like John and Cheryl set up that encourages people to be able to put their hand up. And then if it's not a best idea, because not every idea is the best idea, it's put back in the box in a encouraging way rather than a way that shuts people down.
Yeah, so true. I really agree with what you said, and that's why I guess I was asking earlier about power. It's just so important. There's one person who hasn't spoken yet. I just want a platform, and that's you, Chris, because you've done this interesting work on people's preferences for individual and policy change. I don't know if you have a kind of 1-minute summary of where your thinking is that you might want to share with the group. Chris has been studying what leads people to support individual kind of level responses to climate and biodiversity versus systemic. Chris?
So my thoughts were also like what I heard in there is that also this distinction between, do we talk about just individual behavior change, like recycling, or more like the individual behavior that can actually lead to system change? And I think this distinction is quite important. I guess if you talk about individual behavior change, like I'm afraid of, like if you just look at, so we want to make people kind of feel like the behavior is effective, but there might be these downstream consequences, and something that also Mitzi kind of mentioned briefly, which is if people believe behavior change is very effective, it can also be kind of hijacked in some way. So if I look, for example, I go to Coles, and Coles has like advertising, please recycle more, while they, of course, have everything full of plastic. And for people to make this is believable, if people also believe that this behavior change might actually be effective, so can lead people to actually be okay or like believe in greenwashing. So that's kind of the thoughts I have had.
Yeah. And here in Australia, you know, Clean Up Australia Day is actually funded by industry, and some people would say in a deliberate attempt to channel energy towards individuals who will pick up garbage rather than making companies take responsibility. Look, we do have to finish now. Some of us are going to walk over to another commitment, and I'm confident we'll be talking about this presentation on the way. Such a great talk, a real privilege to be here, Mitzi and Liam, and we really thank you for our time. Can I just ask everyone to show that appreciation again? And I'll be following up with you, Mitzi and Liam. I'll be asking for your slides, which are so fascinating. And I don't know if you feel comfortable. You can let me know. I can circulate them as well. But of course, the recording will be available for people that wanted to stare at the 131 factors that influence decision-making and see if their own PhD topic is in there, right?
It's
Thanks
just recycling, Winnifred. I'm sorry, Gwyneth, can I just ask a quick question? Can we share the link also through our socials once it's available?
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah, it's meant to go out to the world. We're hoping that there'll be system change because Mitzi's information will be available to everyone everywhere all at once. Thanks again. And Liam and Mitzi, if you want to just quickly have a look in the chat, I'm about to close the Zoom and the chat will disappear, but I know some people have been passing on their thanks and questions. Thanks, everyone. All right.
Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you. Bye now.